We were on page 63, the end of the para. The line is, this whole wide world is only he and she. So we'll take up from there. Page 63. This is the knot that ties together the stars. The two who are one are the secret of all power. The two who are one are the might and right in things. His soul, silent, supports the world and her. His acts are her commandments, registers. Well, and this is very obvious if you remember the description of Purusha and Prakriti in the long paragraph that we have had before. And to re-emphasize, that in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy there is no duality. Even what seems to be Purusha and Prakriti are in fact a single consciousness, like the flame and the fire, which have the double function of the light and the burning power, and yet fire is a single entity. So too Purusha and Prakriti, although they are described as two different entities for the play means for the manifestation or creation, they are essentially one. It is the role of what we see as the active and the passive. In creation you will see there is always a combination of the active and the passive. Like for example the ocean or the river, where the bed is passive and then you see the tremendous energies of the waters which are active. So there is always this combination which is really the element of manifestation. So he is emphasizing that this is the knot that ties together the stars, the knot of Purusha and Prakriti, their interplay, their relation of love, what we have seen beautifully described in the previous paragraph. So the knot between the stars is the knot of love. And love, I had mentioned this before too, what we see as the light of the sun, the light of the stars, the light in the cosmos, is actually the outer manifestation or the outer appearance of divine love. So basically there is always this element or the factor of love that is behind this universe, which takes different forms like light or water or vapor or anything. But essentially it is what the Upanishads have given as the question of Ananda, being the beginning, the middle and the end. And love and Ananda are interchangeable. So we come back to the Upanishadic truth that it is the Ananda that ties together the stars. The two who are one are the secret of all power, and they are the might and right in things. You see, might and right not in the sense of judicial manner, but they are the strength, the force, the energy that is flowing in rhythm. The question of right is, the word is rhythm. Rhythm is the rhythm. So you see, in this world, everything is moving in a particular rhythm. And what maintains this rhythm is this energy, this consciousness of the Purusha. So this entire rhythm, this strength, this consciousness is an interplay of Purusha and Prakriti. They are not separate. It is an interplay, a constant interplay. His soul, silent, supports the world and her. His acts are her commandments, registers. So you see, he is there, he means the consciousness, he means the Purusha, he means the Chit. It is that passive support. But without this, as we say, the silence and the word, there's always this combination. So without the silence, without the passive energy, without the passive support, the active dynamic cannot have any possibility. So, happy, inert, he lies beneath her feet. His breast he offers for her cosmic dance, of which our lives are the quivering theatre, and none could bear but for his strength within, yet none would leave because of his delight. You see, there is actually in Indian mythology, there is the figure of Kali dancing on the breast of Shiva. You know, there's a story here where Kali is dancing away and destroying the world. But there's a long story, but to cut it short, that means she is so dynamic, so energetic that there's a time where she wanted to destroy the world. But to quieten her down, to neutralize her destructive energy, Shiva seems to have lied down on the floor, and when she steps up on his breast, she realizes that she is stepping on the breast of Shiva, and then she quietens down. Of course, this is a mythology, but this is the figure that Sri Aurobindo is referring to, that he lies beneath her feet, his breast he offers for her cosmic dance, of which our lives are the quivering theatre. Of course, in this cosmic dance, which is not destructive in Sri Aurobindo's reference here, is more the dance of creation. There's a constant dance of creation. And that dance of creation also needs something static, something solid support. And for her cosmic dance, there cannot be any other support but the breast of Shiva himself, who is the consciousness, the potential quiet consciousness. So there's a beautiful image of absolute silence and absolute concrete support, and on which there's an absolute cosmic dance. So there is the image of the consciousness, the Chit and the Shakti together. And none could bear but for his strength within. You see, this is again a lovely thought that we see reflected in the Life Divine, that we have all these sorrows or suffering or anything, what we say, the dire suffering of humanity. And yet the interesting thing is, we are able to bear this suffering of this world, of this life, because of his strength within. And yet none would leave because of his delight. See, this is what Sri Aurobindo would call the delight of existence. You see, we all have within us this deep source of delight, what we can call the psychic delight or the soul's delight or the Purushal delight. or again to go back to to Upanishads, the Ananda. So you can see now the Upanishadic truth, why they say everything, within everything there is essentially and basically the Ananda element. Because had not there been this Ananda element, or what Sri Aurobindo calls here, his delight, his means the Purusha's delight, we would not have the strength to bear with the sorrow and suffering of this world, the pain and all that. In fact, some days back I was having a talk with somebody. That you see, oftentimes we see people suffering so much, absolute poverty. They don't have sufficient even to eat every day. There's hardly any shelter over their head. And yet, nobody thinks of committing suicide. Suicides are committed because of the mental tensions, because of the ego problems and all that, but not out of the physical extremity. That means not out of absolute poverty and suffering and all that. So when we come to ending one's life, it is more a case of psychological case. But on the physical level, you see, there's so much of suffering, so much of pain. And yet people don't jump to their death. Because we were discussing, then we saw that there is some element, or what Sri Aurobindo calls it here, his strength, the Purusha's delight, the Ananda, the divine element. The joie de vivre, we may say, where is the joie de vivre? He has no meals per day, he has no shelter. So the joie de vivre, or the delight of existence, is not just physical. There is another deeper element where one does not want to live life. I mean, that's the beautiful thing. Even, when people are suffering, they say, no, I want to continue to live. So that's why you will see, if you come to Pondicherry, there are plenty of such cases where rationally you would say, hey, how is it that he is even existing? Why is he existing? But the thing is that man himself or the lady himself, they never ask the question, why am I living in all this poverty? So there is something, the elan, the will to live, the will to power. And what that will to power, the German philosopher would say, is this because of what our Upanishads would say. This is not the will to power or will to live, it's the delight of existence. To exist itself is the delight of the divine. So, we see this a beautiful point here. And this is also referring to a deeper truth, that we could be beyond all this sorrow and suffering if we contact that delight. Because that delight is there as a basic necessity, but even consciously, if I can touch that inner delight, then we could be out of this question of pain and sorrow and suffering. Well, while looking at that, I looked into the writings of the mother, and I chanced upon a very beautiful explanation. This is from volume number 9 of the mother's writings, and at page 303. Of course, it's not so directly connected, but yet there is so much of, the connection in the way that what Sri Aurobindo is telling us, hinting that if you connect the delight, you will have the solution to sorrow and suffering. And let's see the mother's analysis. It's extraordinary, and I really chanced upon it. This is on page 303. This is actually in reply to a passage from the Life Divine on page 842-43, where Sri Aurobindo is writing. Of course, I will not read that long passage, but just one sentence to give you an idea. It is pertinently suggested that if such an evolutionary culmination is intended and man is to be its medium, it will only be a few especially evolved human beings who will form the new type and move towards the new life. That once done, the rest of humanity will sink back from a spiritual aspiration no longer necessary for nature's purpose and remain quiescent in its normal status. Well, so here is describing, it's not that entire humanity will be supramentalized or reach the supermind. It is, as it says, is a few especially evolved human beings who will form the new type. And that's an extraordinarily beautiful passage whenever if I get this time. You see, where he is telling us that once this especially evolved human beings, they touch or they incarnate in themselves the new type, the Superman, or to put it in a simpler manner, once the rung of Superman comes upon earth in reality, in the physical, then this question of a spiritual aspiration, as it puts it here, a spiritual aspiration no longer necessary for nature's purpose, and that will sink back. It's very interesting to see now there's supposed to be and there will be a tremendous enhancement of spiritual aspiration, and humanity is from all sides trying to connect itself to the spiritual aspiration, because that is the needed zone for the next appearance of the Superman. Now, needed zone, what I understand is, like we have the mental zone now, the consciousness of the mind, which is important to become the human beings. You see, if you want to become truly human beings, it's not just because we are born human that we are human beings, but we have imbibed the mental consciousness. Similarly, the zone of aspiration, spiritual aspiration, is required so that this common human being can touch the spiritual zone and thereby and thus become the Superman. But then Sri Aurobindo is telling, once the Superman comes, the race comes, this zone will be withdrawn. As he puts it very bluntly, that once done, the rest of humanity will sink back from a spiritual aspiration no longer necessary. So what it means is that now we have the supermental race, then the human race will continue, and with its continuation, it will be, of course, it says the human mental status will be always there, but it will be there not only as a degree in the scale of rebirth, but as an open step towards the spiritual and supramental status. Well, I think he gets into the rebirth and all that's a bit too complicated. However, this is a passage, if you want to read, page 842 to 843, and this is, I think, not the SABCL, it must be the old edition of the Life Divine. However, now I'll take up the mother's reading. It is obvious that what especially characterizes man is this mental capacity of watching himself live. The animal lives spontaneously, automatically, and if it watches itself live, it must be to a very minute and insignificant degree, and that is why it is peaceful and does not worry. Even if an animal is suffering because of an accident or an illness, this suffering is reduced to a minimum by the fact that it does not observe it, does not project it in its consciousness and into the future, does not imagine things about its illness or its accident. You see, of course, she is going to explain further, but here if you see, the cause of suffering and pain, if we can put it in simple words, which she will emphasize later, is precisely this capacity of man to watch himself. This objective consciousness of man is the source. You see, animal itself, even if it is suffering because of an accident, this suffering is reduced to a minimum by the fact that it does not observe it, does not project it into its consciousness. I mean, we see a lot of animals suffering, the dogs and the cows and all that. But I suppose their suffering is exclusively reduced to the physical, gross physical. The mind and the vital do not at all come into play, saying, look, I've got an infection, what will happen, then these lungs will be infected. The whole theory of the medical sciences, which, the doctors are expert at, of really exaggerating and bringing down this fear. And this is what is perhaps the cause of our suffering. She will explain, with man there has begun this perpetual worrying about what is going to happen. And this worry is the principal, if not the sole cause of his torment. With this objectivizing consciousness, there has begun anxiety, painful imaginations, worry, torment, anticipation of future catastrophes, with the result that most men, and not the least conscious, the most conscious, live in perpetual torment. I mean, it's really an eye-opener, and how much we see the society, the doctors, the lawyers, every one of them, and knowingly, unknowingly, I mean, it's a kind of, I'm not blaming any one profession, but humanity has taken this up consciously and called it different, experts, lawyers and this and that. But all the time, what are we doing? We are doing this, we are objectivizing consciousness, and the worry is the principle. You see your life insurance. That fellow comes home and then gives you half an hour talk, only the fear of death. You are going to die, what will happen to your children, what will happen to this? You see, all the time with perpetual fear, worry, and then people have begun anxiety, painful imaginations, worry. Nowadays you see every advertisement, how you can lose weight. You see how it has been put into our mind, if you are fat, your blood pressure will go up, your angina will grow up. It's nothing but really we are being played upon by all these ads, by all these professions, only to the extent that they are increasing our worry of what will happen. If you are overweight, if you are thin, if you are not doing, if you don't do the morning walk, it's purely an advertisement of objectifying your consciousness and adding worry. So Mother is so clear, began anxiety, painful imaginations. I mean, this is a fantastic thing. The word painful imaginations really struck me, because I know some people who are on the obese side. I mean, there's no end to their imagination that what will happen because I'm obese, I should not eat that, I should drink this. I mean, there are no dearth of people who are adding these painful imaginations, worry, torment, anticipation of future catastrophes. All our bank balances, interest, saving in the bank, future catastrophe. What will happen if you get a disease, if you get ill, who will take care? So she says, man is too conscious to be indifferent. He is not conscious enough to know what will happen. Truly, it could be said, without fear of making a mistake, that of all earth's creatures, he is the most miserable. I mean, once we take a pride that we are the most advanced race, creation of this earth, but he is the most miserable. All the time we live in a negative attitude of fear, of body, of anything. So she says, of all the creatures, without fear of making a mistake, look at her definite stress, without making a mistake, that of all earth's creatures, he is the most miserable. The human being is used to being like that because it is an atavistic state which he has inherited from his ancestors. But it's truly a miserable condition. And it is only with this spiritual capacity of rising to a higher level and replacing the animal's unconsciousness by spiritual superconsciousness that there comes into the being not only the capacity to see the goal of existence and to foresee the culmination of the effort, but also a clear-sighted trust in a higher spiritual power to which one can surrender one's whole being, entrust oneself, give the responsibility for one's life and future, and so abandon all worries. When I found this beautiful passage, again to see the necessity of spirituality. You see, it is not just a fancy, it is not a religion, it is not Aurobill saying, it is not Sri Aurobindo saying, it is not the Upanishad saying. But there is a psychological, logical necessity why we should take to spirituality or a spiritual life. And of course, spirituality you can define in many ways and any way. But what we are taking, the definition that we are alluding to, spirituality is that practice of life where you begin to surrender your life, your future in the hands of a higher power. The moment we start doing that, we begin to live a spiritual life. Until the point where we think, I can take care of myself, I have my doctors, I have my lawyers, I have my people, the spiritual life doesn't begin. It's only when you recognize not only mentally the higher beyond, but also the necessity to surrender to that. And Asha puts it very bluntly, that to which one can surrender one's whole being, entrust oneself, give the responsibility for one's life and future, and so abandon all worries. So, what is it we are trying to do? Instead of trying to be an independent human being, in spirituality, we are trying to become a dependent human being upon the divine force. So, modern rational man may not like the idea that I become dependent. But what I am saying is, we become dependent not upon any other human being, but upon the higher consciousness, whom we call divine, whom we call whatever you want to. In fact, recently, last week, I had been to Hyderabad to give a talk in a cultural center on the foundations of Indian culture. And in that context, I read Sri Aurobindo where he says that why is India called a spiritual country? Is it just because we have the Upanishads and the Gita, but like that every culture, every nation has some scripture to its credit? It's not the question of the scriptures or any Vedas or anything. But as he puts it, here in India especially, there is an automatic, there is a kind of innate, not automatic, an innate turning towards the beyond. We don't know the philosophies, we don't know Gita, we don't know the Upanishads, nothing. But you ask a poor man, so-called poor, this is not materially, but what we say, he's not even educated. But the tendency in him is to rely upon the divine. To say, no, he is there, God is there, Shakti is there, Purnama is there, Challama is there, Samama is there. So his, or what Nolnida puts it as the psychic perspective. That means there is an inner need and an inner automatic dependence upon the beyond. As Sri Aurobindo puts it, we have always recognized that beyond the finite there is the infinite. That beyond the physical there is the supraphysical. So this recognition of the beyond, both on the physical level, the mental level, consciousness level, everywhere, that is an innate characteristic of the Indian psyche. So we don't have to be rationally told, you turn to God, do bhajans for God, depend on God. No. Because of the centuries and centuries of work done by the sages and the saints, it has become a cultural ethos. It runs in our blood, so to say. So, Nolnida or Sri Aurobindo, in their explanation, both of them have stressed very beautifully. Of course, Nolnida explains what Sri Aurobindo has said, that it is the question of, if you see somebody from the audience ask me the question, how do you say that we are innately turned towards the divine? Because you see the country around you, maybe, I don't know how many of you see the TV or the newspaper. There's a whole revolt against corruption, against this. I mean, almost the darkest consciousness of India is coming out now. So does it mean that Indians are not culprit? Does it mean that we are not attached to the repos? We have senseless attachment, we have every attachment for money, for property. We have the same common faults or falsehood that humanity has everywhere in the world. And yet the only positive thing is that unlike any other civilization from the beginning till now, Indians by birth have been given this gift because of this great yoga, the tapasya, the sadhana, done by these millions of people across thousands of years. That, as I think I would quote Nalinida, he says, a spiritual zone has been prepared in India. That's where I took the word spiritual zone. He says, like we have the zone, this layer and that layer in this atmospheric world, he says the spiritual zone has been prepared here because of the tapasya. And now suddenly I remember once I was talking to the mother, and she told me that Sri Aurobindo and me, we have prepared an atmosphere in the ashram congenial for the realization of the soul. You see, the word prepare tells me that these Mahayogis, this great spiritual consciousness, they prepare. They please don't disturb you. So they prepare. So if mother could tell me that in the ashram we have prepared this atmosphere, congenial, convenient for the realization of the psychic being or the soul. And then she said, "Tipo essaye obtenere tonam." Then she said, try to get the soul. Because they are prepared. So just as the mother told me that they have prepared the atmosphere, because I wanted to go out of the ashram and settle down somewhere else, she said, no, if you want a psychic realization, we have done something. So like that, you can imagine thousands of yogis and rishis, Himalayas, known, unknown, have prepared the spiritual zone. So to breathe in India is to breathe the spiritual zone. So externally, outwardly, we may be the same terrible human being in all our negativity or in all our falsehood. We are no better or we may be worse. India is maybe enlisted as the 10th country in its corruption, in its black money. All that is there. But for the psychic realization, just as the mother told me about the ashram, Sri Aurobindo would say about India. So that is the aspect where we say a country is spiritual because of its innate tendency to surrender to the divine. Of course, it is impossible for man to fall back to the level of the animal and lose the consciousness he has acquired. Therefore, for him, there is only one means, one way to get out of this condition he is in, which I call a miserable one, and to emerge into a higher state where worry is replaced by a trusting surrender and the certitude of a luminous culmination. This way is to change the consciousness. You see, this is the essence of whole spirituality. I mean, you may do this integral yoga or that yoga, this yoga, doesn't matter. But essentially, she says the only way is to emerge into a higher state where worry is replaced by a trusting surrender and the certitude of a luminous culmination. Trust in the divine. In fact, if I'm not very wrong in my memory, once Nirodha, or Nirodbaran as you would know him, was explaining the difference between faith and trust. They are two different things. Faith is more passive, more not so focused. It's taken for granted. Yeah, you have the whole being's faith. But trust is much more dynamic. It's more concrete. In fact, very interesting, Nirodha used to sleep in Sri Aurobindo's room. I mean, he was given the duty At night he would sleep there in Sri Aurobindo's room to guard the place, to wish that somebody should be there. And once around 2 o'clock at night, he woke up, hearing Sri Aurobindo's voice, which said, "Have trust in the divine." So then he kind of found out what's the difference between trust and faith. And from then on, after 2 o'clock, he could never sleep. Every day he would get up at 2 o'clock. It became his habit. But I remember in our classes, he was really explaining that trust is a greater, like we have Sri Ramakrishna's example of the mother cat taking the baby cat. That's not faith in the mother cat. That's trust in the mother. That is, trust is much more dynamic, integral, positive. It's much more conscious. Faith can be there unconsciously also. Yes, I have faith in the mother. But you're not doing anything about the faith. You're not really activating that faith. When you make active that faith, that becomes trust. So Mother is telling us here, replaced by a trusting surrender. This is not just surrender, okay, I'm surrendering to the mother. But have trust that this trust, this surrender to the mother is what is going to take you through. And then she says, a luminous culmination. Truly speaking, there is no condition more miserable than being responsible for an existence to which one doesn't have the key, that is, of which one doesn't have the threads that can guide and solve the problems. The animal sets itself no problems, it just lives. I mean, there's a lot to learn, you see, how, in fact, maybe we'll say, they trust Mother Nature. How often did I not wonder when I see the birds, when I see the crows on my terrace, that just they wake up and they know by evening 5 o'clock, they would have filled up their belly. Do they worry to which house should I go and where will I get my invitation, where will I get my breakfast, lunch and dinner? No. There's no mental worry. They don't project themselves into the future, the next hour. They just live moment to moment with an unconscious, perhaps, trust in nature. And they live on till the end of the last day. So, animal sets itself no problems. Its instinct drives it. It relies on a collective consciousness which has an innate knowledge and is higher than itself, but it is automatic, spontaneous. It has no need to will something and make an effort to bring it about. It is quite naturally like that. And as it is not responsible for its life, it does not worry. Absolute beautiful secret. The moment you feel I am responsible for my life, and all your modern philosophy, your corporate philosophy, everyone says you can make your life what you want, you can make of yourself what you desire. All that is humbug, sorry to say, to the corporate world. But what is it that you are doing there? You are saying that I am responsible for my life. Of course, in a very normal way, yes. But in a spiritual way, we cannot say that I am responsible. Always try to bring in this thought subconsciously, and which may become conscious later on, that the divine is responsible for my life. If you can subconsciously repeat this, that he is responsible, I am not responsible. So this is a process of surrender, where you consciously keep saying, no, divine mother, Sri Aurobindo, Krishna, Allah, whatever you want to say, you are responsible for my life. Or you may say, may you become more and more responsible to my life, and may I surrender to thy will. So whereas you see the animal, it is not responsible for life, it does not worry. With man is born the sense of having to depend on himself, and as it does not have the necessary knowledge, the result is a perpetual torment. So what a beautiful analysis. I always love this mother's thing, because psychologically it's extremely, very sharp and very, very to the point. That, you see, we are worrying about our future. We are worried about what will happen to my body. We are worried about what will happen to my illness. We have all the LIC agents in front of you. You have all the people in front of your house because of this worry. But then she is saying, he does not have the necessary knowledge. What knowledge do we have with all the LIC people and everything that you want to support you? Can you really predict what's going to happen tomorrow? We have no knowledge. So perpetually we are in a torment. All the time worried. We lose our objects. What will happen? My God, if I lose this, you lock up your house, you put 3 bars, 5 bars, 3 locks, 4 locks. So perpetually we are thinking of the worry, physical, mental, psychological. This torment can come to an end only with a total surrender to a higher consciousness than his own, to which he can totally entrust himself, hand over his worries and leave the care of guiding his life and organizing everything. That is sadhana. I mean, you can have all the synthesis of yoga, you may read all the 700 pages, but this one line is sufficient to understand that hand over his worries and leave the care of guiding his life. Because we are not able to do that because we lack that trust. We feel that my mind, my planning, that is much more secure, that if I have the bank balance, I have put at a rate of 10%, all that we feel our mind is a greater security than the divine himself. And that's the difference between the common man and the sadhu and the saint. The saint doesn't worry, like we have so many stories of Swami Vivekananda. He never worried about his food or the next meal or anything. But at all times, God has provided him with food. Sometimes, yes, he had to have the patience of not eating anything for 24 hours. But yes, God did bring him food. Once he was traveling, he had no food. He was sitting on a footpath, on a station, not footpath, the station stand, in a station, and he had no food for maybe a day or 2 days. And suddenly he sees one oldish gentleman with a cloth on his head, and then he comes with a bag and says, "Sir, this food is for you." He says, "How do you know?" He says, "No, last night in my dream, God came and told me that there's a person sitting under the tree in that particular station, go and give food." And this is Swami Vivekananda himself narrating, he will not be exaggerating. So that is the ultimate, as we call, the acid test of your trust. But to get that God's vision is much more as a fulfilling than a meal or 3 meals that you have had at a regular time. So who has won? It is not the Marwadi. He was traveling with a fellow who had plenty of food, who had his 3 meals a day. But he just satisfied his hunger. But here was a man who increased his trust. So can we go to that extent of falling sick, going hungry and all that? I said, no. Until God gives me, I will not take my next meal. So that is the thing. It says, how can a problem be solved when one doesn't have the necessary knowledge? And the unfortunate thing is that man believes that he has to resolve all the problems of his life, and he does not have the knowledge needed to it. That is the source, the origin of all his problems. That perpetual question, what should I do? Which is followed by another one still more acute, what is going to happen? And at the same time, more or less, the inability to answer. What should I do? What is going to happen are the 2 questions that are unsolved. And that is the essence of our daily living. What will happen to me tomorrow?
Some of the sadhus with just a bag in the Kedarnath, so many of them, that was all their possession.
Yeah, sometimes, I was telling Deepshika, you see, when we went last year to Kedarnath, we used to see sadhus, walking miles across with just a stick and with just a little bundle on their shoulder. And I often said, my God, this is his entire physical possession. I had suddenly a feeling how relieved they are, how much they are detachment. They don't have the burden of your comforts, of your houses, of your electricity, of your food. And yet he is not hungry. The beauty is, as I said, a delayed food, yes. But it's just taking the stick with a bundle, maybe what is it in that, I don't know what he has, maybe one raincoat or one chadar or one bed sheet. But imagine you are moving across the world with absolutely only in trust, with faith, and you may say he's an ascetic, yes. Sri Aurobindo's philosophy is a little negative. But oftentimes I feel how much burdened are we with our own physical things, mental securities and all that. So here it says, what is going to happen? We have no idea. That's why all spiritual disciplines begin with the necessity of surrendering all responsibility and relying on a higher principle. Otherwise, peace is impossible. There used to be, when the mother was there in the physical, when people joined the ashram, they would come to the mother, offer everything they have. The ladies would take out the necklaces, the earring, this thing, the nose ring, and the men would take out the checkbook and say, Ma, this is at your feet. What belongings are our gold? Gold was offered, cash was offered, everything was offered. This is a question, surrendering all responsibility. Now you are responsible for my food, for my shelter, for my problems, for my health, for everything. So they would literally take out things and give it. And there was a lady who had in her mind that I would like to offer my gold bangles because she had just joined the ashram. And that's what all she had. She was aspiring to do that. But then when she went in front of the mother, perhaps there's some cloud and she forgot. But then the mother herself stretched her hands as if to say, hey, you wanted to give me something. And when she stretched her hand, then the lady remembers, oh my God, yes. And then she really takes out her gold bangles, puts them in her hand. So you see, your aspiration is heard by somebody. So this act of surrendering, what she says, surrendering all responsibility, even physically if you can do that, then it requires a lot of courage. But I'm afraid we are too far from that. And yet consciousness has been given to man so that he can progress, can discover what he doesn't know, develop into what he has not yet become. And so it may be said that there is a higher state than that of an immobile and static peace. Is that trust total enough for one to keep the will to progress, to preserve the effort for progress while ridding it of all anxiety, all care for results and consequences? You see, this is where we link up with the Gita's famous saying that you have the right to work but not to the fruit. And this is where Mother is saying, all care for results and consequences. We are all the time worried about the consequence. What will happen? And if I do this, what will I get? So it is more the consequences, what I'm going to get, which is eating me away with my worry, with my tension, with all that. So Krishna had said, you keep working. But maybe we should add what the mother is telling us here. You keep working with trust in the divine. It's not just blindly, it's a kind of working with a duty, just 9 to 5 hour duty. But if you can increase, I would put it this way, that the whole meaning of work is to increase this trust. You say, if I keep worrying, some of my office boys, those who work on the Sakar, they start worrying, Sakar is not earning money, what will happen? It's not a question of worrying. If I have developed trust in the mother working through Sakar, I've done my work. See, the whole is not the work that to manifest a big place, to have a big institution, no. But if we can increase my trust, yes, I've had ups and downs, I've had problems, I've had this thing, people have gone on strike, people have said something bad. But if I'm saying no, through all this, my aim is to increase my trust in the mother, thank God that all these problems have come by. So the moment you take the responsibility in your hands, you are going anti-spiritual. You may be having a huge company, but how has it helped me? Ko vadis? Where am I going in my faith? So Mother is adding here very clearly, this is one step ahead of the methods which may be called quietist, which are founded on the rejection of all activity and a plunging into an immobility and inner silence, which forsake all life because it has been suddenly felt that without peace one can't have any inner realization, and quite naturally one thought that one couldn't have peace so long as one was living in outer conditions, in the state of anxiety in which problems are set and cannot be solved, for one does not have the knowledge to do so. This is, I was just referring to this ascetic attitude, that life is full of problems, there are so many attachments, there are so many ups and downs, so get rid of all the activities. So I become a sannyasin, I take up my little bag and then walk into the Himalayas. But that's not the intention of life. So what Madhavan is telling us and what Sri Krishna has told us is the via medium. That means you be in this world, walk on this earth, go through life, continue to act, but there are two conditions. One, do not worry about the results and the consequences. Second, act with the trust in the divine. And I've seen if you act with the trust in the divine, your actions themselves become so-called right actions, right decisions, right ways. Because you're acting with a liaison with the divine. You're not acting solely by your mind and your vital and your physical. You see, if we can add this fourth dimension of the trust in the divine, you may act rationally, you may act emotionally, you may have sentimentally, you may have all that. But add one more dimension saying, no, through my decisions, she will act, the mother will act. So if we can add this dimension, then your life is wonderful. You may make errors in the beginning, you may make errors in many ways, but what is it that I'm gaining is, Ma, you are guiding me. Ma, let my trust in you increase. Let thy will be my will. So these are the little prayers. I'm not asking for object or success or failure or money or anything. Because all these things is one thing, but at the end of the day, the wealth that I gain is the wealth of my trust in the divine. And that trust and surrender. These are the only perhaps the spiritual goals I would look forward to. How to increase these two. And then she would say, so that was the quietest way, the impassive, the passive, the ascetic way, but Sri Aurobindo would not take to that. The next step is to face the problem, but with the calm and certitude of an absolute trust in the Supreme Power, which knows and can make you act. And then instead of abandoning action, one can act in a higher peace that is strong and dynamic. You see, these are almost, I get the ring of Bhagavad Gita when we read all these sentences. That instead of abandoning action, one can act in a higher peace that is strong and dynamic. So higher peace is not quietist, is not abandoning action. But you are in a higher consciousness where you are quiet, as she says, where you face the problem, but continuously in the heart of hearts, she would say, have this absolute trust in the Supreme Power. So this is what I would say the constant japa. Okay, there are lots of different ways of doing japa, Japa is, uttering the name of the divine. But people have said, utter the word mother, utter the word Sri Aurobindo, utter the word mama. That's the japa, constant uttering. But for my understanding, I would say, this is the japa I would like to follow if I could, is this trust in the Supreme Mother, Supreme Power. That I will act outside, but constantly I am saying, Mother, let my trust and surrender increase. Let my emotional surrender increase. Let my mental surrender increase. Whereas outwardly I am facing a situation, but I have seen if we have this constant japa or the vibration of the japa, outwardly your action also becomes very peaceful. You are not agitated, you are not angry, you are not shouting. You are not really, taking cudgels and say, hey, what the hell have you done? Your outer action itself starts reflecting this inner peaceful vibration. So if this inner japa could be made constant, the outer one automatically becomes quiet. And an action and a reaction done in quietness and calmness has greater benefits for both the listener and you. So what the mother is saying, instead of abandoning, act in a higher peace that is strong and dynamic. This is what could be called a new aspect of the divine intervention in life, a new form of intervention of the divine forces in existence, a new aspect of spiritual realization. Why is she calling a new aspect? Because till now our spiritual aspirations were quiescent, for the quietest way, as she puts it. But now, but it's not the question of now, since the time of the Gita we have been told about this, do not hanker for these quietest methods. Never withdraw from life. As all of you know the story of Mahabharata, Arjuna was asked to fight. He was not just going to an office. He was in the middle of a thick war. He says, fight you must. Because as it says, Kurukshetra is not just that place where the battle took place, but our entire life is a Kurukshetra, is a constant battle. So in this battle he says, continue to fight. He says, with my name on your lips. So of course he didn't say the word on your lips, but the thing is, keeping me within, he says, act outside. So the mother is also concluding with the same thing, that have the trust in the supreme power and act with this trust. So, well, you see, I did go a little astray, but this question of the surrender, the dependence on the divine, not to worry, and this single sentence led me to search for this, that yet none would leave because of his delight, and none could bear but for his strength within. You see, oftentimes I go at a tangent, but that's how I enjoy my Savitri. But there's always a deeper dimension. Otherwise I could have just read that line and said, fine, because of his delight. But I wanted to probe into the question, what happens with his delight within? How does it take you away from sorrow and suffering? Because that is the essential strength, the delight. And then otherwise we say, realize your psychic being and all that could be sort of sadhana part. But here is philosophic. And what the mother has given you, the trust in the divine. Otherwise you see, we may have to suffer. I'm not saying it will come in a day. But I would say such a life is much more meaningful, joyful, fruitful. At the end of the day you say, wow, it's been a beautiful day because I trusted the mother. And it did not happen. Recently I went to Hyderabad. I had some plans to do that. But I said, Ma, I'm going there. This is my mental planning, but do thou what thou willest. When I went there, that work did not happen. It did not take place. But it did not touch me. I said, fine. The mother didn't want it. But I put in my effort. I traveled to Hyderabad. I did all that. But so-called failure. But I said, no. What is the success? I have gained one more, a shadow of a greater trust in the mother. Ma, it's your way. That means it is not to be for my work. So all these negative and positive experiences, if they can bring us this little increase in our trust, our day is done. At the end of the day, our life is done. Yeah, I think I'll close it at that in this conference.